welcome to episode 239 of our SAP on Azure video podcast. Today is April 13th, and together with Goran, we are here to talk about anything related to SAP and Microsoft. Hello, everyone. So after focusing on AI in the last few shows, let's get back to something more deterministic, storage. We had already talked about sophisticated storage requirements for SAP S/4HANA projects and how Azure NetApp Files provides one of the best and most performant options for the most demanding workload. However, flexibility was sometimes an issue. With the new flexible service level, ANF allows you to independently configure storage capacity and throughput, optimizing costs and performance by right-sizing based on your needs. To give us more insights on this and covering the latest news around ANF in general, we have Geert joining us again. Welcome, Geert. Welcome back to our show.
Yeah, again, great to be here, Holger. I think friend of the show by now. I think I've been on the show for a couple of times, and it's always great to be with you guys to talk about the latest and greatest that we have to offer from the boring topic of storage point of view. I think there's a lot more to it than people realize oftentimes. So I'll try to elevate the conversation a little bit beyond the bits and the bytes of storing data, but also to provide good insights in terms of features and functionality that we bring and brought to benefit customers, especially in the database and SAP HANA space, right? So we're trying to make it a bit more relevant for actual uses than just the bits and the bytes.
No, and I think this is perfect because we sometimes, I think, forget when we talk about AI and integration topics that all of this needs to run on some infrastructure, and infrastructure, one important thing is storage. Especially in S/4HANA, very high performance storage is really, really crucial. And so I think it's really, really good to also have these topics covered. And I mean, I couldn't think of anyone better than having you here to talk about Azure NetApp Files.
Yeah, I think as a first step up from storage, what we try to do is always talk about data more than storage itself. I mean, at the end of the day, every application runs on data, or every use case runs on data, every business runs on data. And especially if you look at AI and all the fancy stuff that we can do nowadays, it doesn't exist without data, right? So data, of course, needs to be stored. So that's the mundane part of it. But in doing so, you need to think about doing it right and at the right performance and at the right cost as well. And I think we've gone through, let's say, a long journey with Azure NetApp Files to provide performance storage, scalable storage, and now we have focused last year especially, and now with this new announcement as well, we focused on making it more cost effective than ever before. So I think that is ultimately what we try to do. And yeah, I mean, obviously data is more important than anything in the world by now, right? So I think we're in a great spot when we talk about data rather than storage, but it's great to be here.
Absolutely. But Geert, before we dive into the topic, maybe you can quickly tell us a little more about you, what you do with Azure NetApp Files, actually.
Yeah. So for those who don't know me, maybe the first time watching the show or be with in the show with me around. So I'm product manager or director of product management, if you will, for Azure NetApp Files, which is of course Microsoft's first-party enterprise file storage service. Which is powered by NetApp technology in Azure data centers, right? So my team is responsible for what we call outbound product management, meaning we take all the features and functionality that we deliver from a roadmap and engineering perspective and turn it into real use cases and real use and solutions, meaning we make it relevant for a variety of application use cases. And with Azure NetApp Files, of course, we have been focusing on, let's say, SAP HANA databases for a long time, but of course we've also diversified across a variety of other use cases, right? So we deliver value for AVS or Azure VMware Solutions, for VDI deployments, for let's say general purpose file sharing, unstructured data. So there's like tons of uses, high performance computing, of course. All of that relies on file storage for a large part. And that's where Azure NetApp Files brings a lot of value. So again, as we focus on SAP and HANA and databases in this section, of course, we span across a variety of use cases. And what we see, of course, as well now is an increase in interest in, let's say, using all the data that you store on Azure NetApp Files with AI and data
Yep.
applications as
Yep.
well, right? So there's actually even more exciting news coming down the line. Now, we've talked about it at Ignite in November a little bit, but we're going to do some announcements soon where especially that that area of AI and machine learning will be further improved with Azure NetApp Files. So there's, I think, nice, exciting times coming. But again, let's talk about what is particularly of interest in this section for SAP databases, etc.
Fantastic, fantastic, yeah. And as you said, I mean, data is the new very important foundation, basically. And if you look, I mean, honestly, I have to admit, I don't watch the news all the time on storage, but if you actually take a look at what has happened in the last few months, quite a lot of things have happened. And then maybe that's something where we can get started, where you provide us with an overview of what has happened in the last few
Yeah,
months.
well, absolutely. Let me start by sharing my screen so we can have a look at it. I think we should be able to see right now, right? So what I basically did, of course, I prepared a little bit for this podcast to kind of prepare a few pages that with topics that I want to talk about. And one of the things I want to quickly run through is, let's say, our typical what's new, run through since the last time I was on the show. And I think last time was in December or November. So let me quickly scroll back to December and kind of scroll all the way up to kind of showcase the new things that we've delivered, and especially the ones, let's say, call out the ones that are important for SAP HANA and database scenarios, right? So if you look in December, I think one of the interesting things, although it sounds like, say, almost mundane, I think one of the interesting things that we've announced is the minimum volume size of Azure NetApp Files volumes, right? So especially in use cases like shared files, you typically don't need tons of capacity, but you need proper shared file storage with proper performance and proper capabilities. With that, we've lowered our minimum volume size to 50 gigabytes, down from 100, which means that you can be more effective and more space efficient for those small portions of the data, like shared files and other scenarios where you don't need much capacity and basically take out a lot of the waste, right? So especially if you have a lot of the, let's say, system landscapes with a lot of shared file areas, we don't need much capacity. You tend to have a lot of, let's say, overcapacity, which you're not effectively using. So with this, we basically create a lot of storage efficiency. Another area of improvement is it's a little bit, let's say, cryptically described. But if you want to run a cross-zone replication failover scenario between zones, you want to be able to deploy volumes with the same volume name and the same mount point in the two zones, right? And historically, whenever you deployed a volume or two volumes within a region, every volume had to have a different name, which basically caused a differentiation or difference in mount points, and that causes a lot of management overhead if you want to do a failover. Yep. So we resolved that with this other feature where, between zones or within different zones, you can have a volume with the same name and the same mount points, which ultimately leads to simplified failover scenarios, right? So two kind of minor features, but still from a simplicity standpoint, a lot of improvements. What we announced in January I think is a little bit more important, and especially for, let's say, customers in the governance or government space or regulated industries have been asking for support for volumes with customer managed keys in application volume group for Oracle and SAP HANA. Right. So originally, of course, initially we could create multiple volumes using AVG, but they were always with platform managed keys, and transitioning that to customer managed keys was cumbersome. Now, since January, we support that with customer managed keys straight from the application volume groups, which obviously is of interest for many of those regulated industry type customers. Then if we look at February, I think there's a few items that I quickly want to point out. Actually, one, I think is mostly around the general availability of AzAcSnap version 11. With a bunch of updates, right? So we continuously, of course, work with the AzAcSnap team to provide support across the board. One key area of improvement is the GA support for Microsoft SQL Server. So if you have SAP deployments based on Microsoft SQL Server that would run on on A&F, then obviously that would be something to make use of. And there's a bunch of other enhancements as well, of course, but I don't want to dwell on that too much. Then if we look at, I think the bigger portion of the improvements are actually in March, right? So if we look at March, of course, that's where let's say the famous or infamous flexible service level came on. We'll talk about that a whole lot more throughout the podcast, but let me touch on a few other items as well. And I think in particular, the general availability of application volume group for Oracle and the general availability of application volume group for SAP HANA extension 1 are of importance, right? So I think the major changes, if you look at SAP HANA support with AVG, are the support for availability zone volume placement, right? So instead of having to require, PPG pinning with AV sets in a specific zone and all the overhead that came with that, we basically did away with that by just supporting application volume group with availability zone placement, which means that as long as your virtual machines or your AV sets are, and your PPG of that is placed in an AZ, then and your A&F volumes get deployed in the same AZ, then your latency will be in order and your failure domain will be in the right place as well, such that you have basically fully self-managed deployment for a zonal deployment for AVG. We support the same with AVG for Oracle, right? So that means that all of the, let's say, all that manual pinning and let's say complicated deployment is totally removed. Other support is in AVG for HANA is support for standard network features throughout. Right, so now you can make use of all the standard network features that are available, and we also support customer managed keys in GA as well. Right, so those are two major enhancements. Another one of importance is, and actually quite a few large SAP customers and deployments are making use of it, is the general availability of the added network features enhancement. Basically, the ability to transform or move let's say basic network features, network deployments to standard network features without downtime. Right, so that basically means if a customer wants to make use of all these of all these NSGs and UDRs and benefits of standard network features, customers can now transition those existing deployments from basic networking to standard networking without any downtime. Which is, of course, of major importance for those enterprise customers going forward. And then, again, I think flexible service level. So I'll touch on that a little bit more. So let me first talk about the key features for AVG for SAP HANA, right? So again, the key ones are availability zone volume placement support. Support for standard network features, and the support for customer managed keys in those. And again, of course, the general availability of application volume group for Oracle. I'm not sure if I've covered it in the previous session. I think I did, but really to quickly touch on the benefits of application volume group for Oracle in particular is that we can now deploy large-scale deployments across multiple data volumes to allow for increased performance and increased capacity for these Oracle databases, right? So think about if you have an Oracle deployment that spans maybe tens of terabytes or even over 100 terabytes in size, then you can deploy those across multiple Azure NetApp Files volumes with the optimal deployment also from a placement as well as from a performance standpoint, right? So again, imagine if you have we have customers literally running Oracle, instance of running at 6 gigabytes per second throughput, or even higher, 8 to even 10 gigabytes per second throughput, which basically means you're pushing your virtual machine to the limit. But with Azure NetApp Files, you can actually achieve those with application volume group for Oracle as well, right? So again, targeting these large scale deployments and making the deployments of that a whole lot easier. So again, before we move on, I think to the main topic, let me know if there's anything you want to touch on, Holger, before we move on.
No, all good. Right. Great recap. Yep.
Yeah, and then let's talk about flexible service level, right? So if you go to the flexible service level documentation page, of course, you see the standard, premium, and ultra storage, descriptions as usual. And we all know for the longest time, when you deploy capacity pools of either of those three service levels, you will get a performance budget that is linear to the size of the capacity pool, right? Mm-hmm. So the bigger the capacity pool, the more performance budget you get based on the service level, right? So with standard, you get 16 megabytes per second throughput per terabyte. If you deploy 10, you get 1600 or 160. If you deploy a premium, you get 64 megabytes per second. If you deploy 10, you get 640, etc. Right? So that basically means bigger equals more throughput.
Yep.
Now, that also means reverse, right? Smaller equals less throughput. And that creates a certain, let's say, challenging paradigm in a variety of cases where, if you have a situation where you either have a very small footprint capacity-wise, but you need a lot of throughput, that means that you need to over-provision because you need to linearly scale your capacity and the throughput, right? So let's say you have a deployment where you say, I need 1,000 megabytes per second or something throughput, then, with premium storage, that means that you would need at least 15 terabytes or so to deploy. And if your database is only 2, then you have 13 terabytes of excess capacity, which which you don't really need. Yep. Of course, you can use it for other use cases, like maybe a backup dump or something, but it's it's kind of a waste in case you don't need it. And conversely, right, if you have a large footprint, let's say you have a 12 terabyte database, HANA instance or 24 HANA instance, but it's a DR deployment, right? So you don't need it, you don't need the performance during your normal operations. Then, you need to deploy 24 terabytes of capacity. You may need to actually deploy premium or ultra in case you need the performance, but you're not using any of that performance really at any point in time unless you're in DR. What you basically want to deploy, a large capacity, but minimum throughput. You want to be able to independently scale that throughput as you need it, right? And that's exactly what a flexible service level allows you to do. So there's two main benefits with flexible service level. First and foremost, as you mentioned, you can deploy your capacity independent of the throughput. So you basically get two knobs or two parameters that you can apply to any volume at any point in time, which means that you can create a very small footprint with a certain amount of high amount of capacity, or with throughput, or you can deploy a large amount of capacity with a minimum amount of throughput. And the minimum amount of throughput you get with any flexible service level capacity pool is always 128 megabytes per second. So that's kind of your starting point, right? And that means that if you go through the documentation here, and there are a couple of examples, is if you look at here, you basically always get, independent of the amount of terabytes you deploy, you always get a baseline throughput of 128 megabytes per second for starters, right? So 1 terabyte, you only need 128 megabytes per second, fine, you can deploy that. Normally you get 1 terabyte and you need, if it's standard, you would need, 128 divided by 16 equals, 20 terabytes or something to deploy 128 megabytes. So with this, you can really tune your deployment to your liking. And that means, for that example that I gave you, if you have a 24 terabyte HANA instance, or worse, if you have a 100 terabyte Oracle instance and it's a DR scenario, you can basically say, hey, provision me 100 terabyte or 24 terabyte and give me the minimum throughput. And I don't pay for the extra throughput either, because you pay for capacity and performance independently, right?
But then, let's now say the failover happens, then I can easily scale up again.
Yeah, so you can always scale up your performance independent or immediately, right? So within certain boundaries, right? Of course, there's a certain boundary depending on your capacity, and there's a nice table here, right? So just to give you the example, if you take a 100 terabyte example, 100 terabyte volume, you start with 128, and you can scale all the way up to 5 times the ultra throughput times the 100 terabyte capacity is like 64 gigabytes per second throughput, roughly, on the capacity pool level. Now, each individual volume, of course, has its own maximums, but the total of throughput that you can get is massive compared to where you were without. And yes, you can scale it up, right? So you can just programmatically scale it up, change your throughput to any number that you need. Of course, you pay for what you provision, right? So let's say if you only need 2 gigabytes per second throughput, I would recommend scaling it to 2 gigabyte, not to more, because everything more would be excess and you pay for. And then after 24-hour cooldown period, you can also scale it back down, right? So let's say after a week, let's say DR period, and you go back to flip back to your normal production environment, you can then scale it back to the original 128 megabytes per second that you started with. So yeah, and that's kind of, from a functional perspective, kind of what it does, right? And what it basically means is that you have this independence of scalability, but it also means that it comes with cost effects, right? And cost savings typically, right? And in order to give you a little bit of insights in what that means, we can go to the Azure NetApp Files tools page and click the performance calculator, right? And to kind of give you an idea of what the effect would be for any given deployment. And you can give me the inputs if you want, but I'll give you one for starters. Let's say we want a 1 terabyte, we have a 1 terabyte HANA instance, right? Or a HANA database. And we want that 1 terabyte to deliver, well, give me 1 gigabyte per second, would be, all up with data volume, and it's a bit over, but let's say we want 1 terabyte with 1,024 megabytes per second throughput, right? What it means is that with either standard, premium, or ultra, you would need to massively over provision. With standard, for instance, you need to actually provision 64 terabytes to meet the performance number, which of course leads to a massive increase in cost. On the other end of the spectrum, if you go to ultra, of course, you would only need to provision 8, but it's still 8 times more than you would actually need, which gives you a 3K number. With flexible service level, you can provision exactly what you need: a 1 terabyte throughput, 1 gigabyte per second throughput. It will provide, because it is more than the minimum, it will get you 2 terabyte capacity pool, but the cost will come down to 2K per month, which is about, I would say, 30% savings compared to ultra in that scenario, right? So now let's look at the opposite, right? So let's say we want a 100 terabyte DR instance, and we only provision 128 megabytes per second throughput, right? So in that case, with ultra, if you were to provision ultra, because if you want to scale it up to maybe 4 gigabytes per second at some point in time, you need to provision 100 terabytes at a rate of 40K. In flexible service level, you can provision 100 terabyte with 128 megabytes per second at a rate of 11K, which is 25% off the original of ultra in that case. And if we were to then scale it up to, let's say, 10 times the amount or the throughput, then I would only pay 13K for that period of time. If I scale it back, I go back to this amount again.
And then after 24 hours, I could scale back again, and then I pay again the lower price. Exactly. This is actually pretty cool, because I still remember when we had originally these discussions with some customers that they, exactly like what you indicated at the beginning, that they only had a requirement for a very small volume size, for example, but they had high throughput requirements, or the other way around, or something like that, and then it was sometimes a little complicated to find the right SKU, to find the right setup to address these scenarios. And as you also said, then we were quite inventive and said, look, then let's use this remaining storage for other things, but now I can really tailor it to exactly the requirements that I have, and I still get a very good price for this then.
Yeah, exactly that, right? So I think one of the challenges that, when you are, let's say, landing yourself in a conversation where, you have over provision, so let's try to find other scenarios or use cases for that, over provision capacity. I mean, and that's a rough conversation to have with the customer, right? I mean, it's not something that, unless there's a real scenario where you can consolidate, right? Because it's a big landscape, fine, you can find your way. But if there's like certain smaller size deployments and then many of them, you can imagine, if you look at an ISV, for instance, that has a service that has, a lot of small scale deployments, there's little chance of consolidating because you want to have your isolated tenant, right?
Yeah.
Within an isolated tenant, this gives you the exact opportunity to do exactly what you say, right size to your use, and only, let's say, dimension or let's say provision what you need and when you need it, and therefore only pay for it when you need it.
Mm-hmm. No, this is really cool. And this is available now in preview, so customers
Yes, it's available today in preview. We launched it in 19 regions originally, but since this week it's available in all Azure NetApp Files available regions.
Oh, fantastic.
So yeah, it's available in preview everywhere, basically.
Cool. Oh, this is really nice. This is really great, and I'm sure a lot of customers that are using Azure NetApp Files, for them is this is perfect. And I think this will probably also be very interesting for new customers that have not yet looked at Azure NetApp Files, to see the flexibility and to leverage this in their projects.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, to touch on one extra thing, right? I think I mentioned it before in one of the podcasts when we talked specifically about Oracle type deployments. I think one of the challenges with Oracle type deployments is those are typically somewhat capacity heavy, but they're also throughput heavy. And since they're throughput heavy, you would need another storage bandwidth available on the virtual machine. Now, the benefit of network attached storage is that every VM SKU, and if you look at older regions, especially with the new ones nowadays, the amount of throughput that you get on the network is way beyond what you get on the disk size, right? On the disk side, which means that you can lower your VM SKUs, still get the performance out of it what you need, and with this flexible service level also way better tailor your storage cost and save on the TCO as well as on the VM as well as on the storage. So I think it all in all gives you an opportunity to, how would I say, use the cloud scale and elasticity to the maximum and to your benefit to lower your cost of operations rather than increase your cost of operations that oftentimes happen when you over provision.
Oh, cool. Yeah, absolutely. Well, nice, Geert. This is really, really great, and thanks for the update. And also here, this calculator tool. This is also really great to really see the numbers. You can easily put something in, and then you can compare what's the best SKU for me to select. Really nice.
Yeah, exactly. And you can fiddle around, right? So let's say just another example. Let's say I will have a 4 gigabytes per second throughput requirement at some point in time. Then I can immediately see that standard wouldn't even be possible, applicable anymore. It couldn't deliver that. Your earliest point or lowest point would be premium, which would cost you 30K in this scenario with 100 terabytes. With Flexbile, it's 20K, right? So it's like a 30% savings really right off the bat.
Yeah,
and it doesn't even include like things like reserved capacity and any of those benefits as well. But yeah, we can have a whole other podcast about those kind of things later on.
No, sounds perfect. Thank you. Great. Yeah. Geert, again, thank you so much for the update. I think it's, again, as you said, everyone is talking about data. So data is super important. And with this, we have the foundation to actually make the data really work and make it available. Thank you so much.
Yeah, data is important. We don't want to pay too much for it. And I think this is one of the ways to get there.
Sounds good.
All right.
Great. Geert, thank you again. Looking forward to our next update. And till then,
couple of months time, and thanks for having me again, Oliver. And good to see you. Let's connect soon. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Thank you. Bye-bye.